You're out with this book this week. What incredible timing to be writing about your experience as a whistleblower amid what's happening right now. For those who don't know your pretty remarkable story, can you give me the cliff notes of what this book is and what your experience has been?
Yeah, so the book is about sort of my journey from being recruited at a UK-based military contractor that specialized in information and psychological operations, where we were looking at some of the ways that we can use data and profiling to identify people who would be more vulnerable to being targeted by extremist organizations and how to mitigate that problem, to the acquisition of that company by an alt-right billionaire who then put Steve Bannon in charge of the company, who became my boss. And watching the work that I and others were putting their heart and soul into be completely inverted, where the same kinds of people, typically young unmarried men who are more prone to paranoid ideation, were being targeted not to mitigate extremism but to radicalize them further, and with the alt-right. And one of the things that I think the book sort of helps draw parallels to is that there is a problem with extremism in America. I hope that when people read it, they take pause and think, even if the company Cambridge Analytica has dissolved, the people are still around, many of whom are working in the Trump campaign now. And my real worry is what happens when China decides to become the next Cambridge Analytica.
With what we're dealing with right now and the fallout from the Ukraine controversy and the whistleblower complaint, when you hear the president say things like spies and treason and remember what we used to do in the old days, as a whistleblower yourself, what's your response to that? How do you feel when you hear that kind of rhetoric?
We need to celebrate whistleblowers. And I don't just say that, because of, my own story. I think, too, the number of times other whistleblowers have talked to me, after I came forward to share, their stories. We need to take pause and, I think, show a bit more concern and respect for that process.
Because it's a huge risk. I mean, I imagine when you're deciding to do this, you're not like, oh man, this is going to be a fun ride I'm about to embark on.
No. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how complicated it is, particularly when you're simultaneously reporting people, who sat on the National Security Council of the United States and also the Russian ambassador. And how complicated and sometimes messy that can be.
I think what's interesting for people to understand too is you blow the whistle and there's all of this complicated fallout, some of which you anticipate, some of which you don't. And then at the end of it, sometimes the problem is solved, but a lot of the time it's much, much, much more complicated than that, and some loose ends. We are still very much dealing with the fallout of what you write about.
One of the things that I talk about in the book is we need to really have a conversation about the impact of technology on our democracy. I personally do not think that relegating so much of our public forum and public discourse to private tech companies is a good idea. I think that we need to value it more than that. And so, I offer some suggestions about what we could do, or at least where to start that conversation.
Whistleblowers are often praised by some percent of the population, and then there is also
vilified.
A lot of blowback, and they're vilified. So having the experience that you've had, and I'm sure you've seen both sides of that as well, how do you interpret this moment that we're in with regard to how we treat and understand whistleblowers?
For me, I think, particularly when I look at what's happening now with the whistleblower with respect to Ukraine and all the phone calls, that it's surprising to hear Republicans, for example, talk about how to create a partisan response to something that should be frankly concerning to everybody. In this case, it sounds like this person did everything that they should. Right? They went to, the independent legal counsel and the inspector, and it went through, the machinations that
officials in the Justice Department are saying that person absolutely went by the book.
Yeah, and yet you still have, the president implying that this person should be lynched. So it doesn't matter, what the technical processes are, that has a chilling effect. And if you are an American and you want to know what's happening in your government, particularly when something goes wrong, you want whistleblowers to feel safe. And the fact that we have particularly Republicans not calling out the president for that, I think is outrageous.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.